Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And this evening I'm going to be talking a little bit about practical implementation of long-term athlete development and physical literacy. And this is something that, as many of you have attended webinars and been part of the presentations that have taken place in your countries with our experts, Richard Way, Ishvan Bali, Drew Mitchell, I understand, are getting to the point of going, okay, so how do we implement this? How can we make this happen in our nation, in our national sport federation, and how do we actually, begin to implement? So we're going to share with you over the next few minutes some of what has been effective in Canada and some other nations, and there's going to be opportunities, as Tyler said, for us to have some discussion time. And certainly by the end of our hour together, I hope that we'll have had a good discussion and interaction and given you some ideas about how you might move forward with practical implementation of long-term athlete development and physical literacy. So, as I said, here's our basic question. How can we support the implementation of LTAD and physical literacy in our nations, our national federations, and across the whole Caribbean region? And you might ask the question, why would a Canadian system work in the Caribbean to begin with? So I had a great opportunity a couple of years ago of presenting to a CANOC group, and if any of you were there at the time, you might remember that I used this example. Here's a map of Canada. It's about 5,000 kilometers wide. It has about 30 million people. And most of the population in Canada is scattered along the southern edge of the country, and there's a lot of big emptiness in between. And when we think about the Caribbean nations, it's in some ways geographically not that different. I'm aware of some of the challenges that people have, for example, in the Caribbean traveling from one nation to another. No direct flights, have to go via somewhere else. It can take you hours to go a relatively short distance, separated by water and small population centers. But in some ways in Canada we face some similar challenges, because when we start thinking about how we're going to implement a national program, we do face limitations of the regions, the particular requirements of our provinces, differences between our communities, and so on. So some realities we share, and we're going to talk about some things that have been helpful for us as we go.
Well, I'm just going to jump in there for a second. Andy's got his hand up, so I'll, if you don't mind, I think he's got a question for you.
Sure.
You can go ahead, Andy, when you're ready. Hi, Andy, can you hear me? It's Tyler speaking. All right,
maybe we'll hang out with
an inadvertent hand up, so we'll, sorry about that, Paul, I'll let you continue.
No worries. Thank you. Yeah, certainly typing in the chat box is also a good way to get our attention, and Tyler's going to monitor the chat box, so if you do have a question or a comment, that's another great way. So, as I was about to say, one important thing that's happened in Canada is we've been successful. Over the course of 11 years, just over 10 years, we've actually moved to a point where all of our national sport organizations have developed sport-specific long-term athlete development frameworks. We've worked with well over 100 sport organizations and governments across the country. We've generated dozens of new documents and resources. I know you've seen some of those and been shown how you can access more. We've held an annual summit, and again, I know we've had many friends from the Caribbean who've visited and taken part in our summit over the years, over 500 leaders a year. It's going on over 10 years now. Sports have developed by now nearly 100 modified programs, and provincial and local, municipal city level champions are building networks and strategies to implement both quality sport and physical literacy. So 10 years is not a very long period of time to do all this. And I guess my opening point is it can be done, and we have been able to make some important inroads to the point where I can say that long-term athlete development is the organizational paradigm of Canadian sport. Coaches, sport leaders, and others now speak the language of long-term athlete development. Two coaches from completely different sports can talk about their train-to-train athletes with some understanding about what that means. And one thing that's made it happen is that we've focused on cross-sector partnerships, recreation, education, health, and sport, and tried to find ways to bring them around the table and work together. And this will be a key anywhere that you're trying to implement a program like long-term athlete development or physical literacy. Sport often works by itself, but reaching out and working with some other partners can be tremendously important. And as you probably heard by now or know, long-term athlete development has been utilized and implemented in nations around the world. Of course, Canada, other Caribbean, or other Commonwealth nations like Scotland, Ireland, England, several Caribbean nations before this project got started. The United States Olympic Committee, if you go to their homepage, they have the American Development Model. And if you look at the American Development Model for a minute, you'll realize that it's really the long-term athlete development model. Some American national sport organizations, other nations like South Africa, Qatar, Bahrain, we're working with a state in India around physical literacy development. So there has been a tremendous uptake around the world.
I've got a question for you. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. A question here for you from Tyrone. Beyond the geographical spread, what are the other similarities? What about culture and resources?
Well, we definitely have a wide variety of cultures in Canada. Of course, we have Quebec as predominantly a French-speaking culture. New Brunswick, likewise, is fully bilingual but has a large French-speaking contingent. A lot of English spoken in the rest of the country, so that's certainly raised one level of challenge. We have a wide variety of diverse ethnic groups and nationalities living in Canada. That's also presented a certain level of challenge. All of those things are challenges in some way, but in other ways they've been assets in terms of bringing together people with different experiences in sport from their home nations. In terms of resources, there are some differences, but there are also, I think, some similarities. If you look at our smallest provinces, the Atlantic provinces, for example, some of them are both small in population and in resources. Others, like Ontario, our largest province, has a lot more. So those are also things that have to be factored in as we in Canada deliver any program, whether it's long-term athlete development or others. So, you know, I don't want to overstate how similar we are, because I know that we're not completely similar, but there definitely are similarities that have raised some challenges. Far north of Canada, again, you know, big empty space with small population groups, and the challenges of getting around northern Canada are formidable. So I think there's some similarities.
And Paul, there's a question from Anthony. How long on average did it take for the other countries who implemented the LTAD framework to do so?
Most of those have followed with the same implementation time frame. Long-term athlete development emerged in the early 2000s. Istvan Bali and Richard Way are certainly two of the architects and leaders. Sport Canada decided to make it a project that they supported in 2005, so that accelerated our integration in Canada. In other countries, interest started about the same period, 2002, 3, 4. Those that have gotten further started probably around 2007, 8. On the screen now you can see South African Sport for Life. Istvan Bali worked with them. This, I think, is probably about 6 years old now. So other nations are at different states, but probably a similar kind of time span. So to give you some more examples, Barbados certainly has done some work this with Dr. Colin Higgs, who many of you know and who has supported a number of different initiatives in the Caribbean nations. Caribbean Coaching Certification Program, which I'm sure again you're all familiar with, and again Dr. Colin Higgs participated in the development of, so a link there to long-term athlete development. So there are some places where there's a foundation that's been built and can be expanded on. So just to, go back to the basic principles, which again I know that you've seen over the last months as we've worked together on this project. Foundation of physical literacy is something that we want to give to every child, every Canadian child, probably every Caribbean child. Every child around the world should be physically literate, meaning that they're competent, confident, and motivated in fundamental movement and sports skills. So a fundamental question for all of us is, how can we work, whether we're sports, education organizations, health, or whatever, to support this fundamental, foundational ability for all youth? And from there, some will go into sport. We know that not everyone will go into sport, and out of those that do participate in sport, a very few will make it to high performance. But again, long-term athlete development offers an optimal development pathway, a progressive, systematic development pathway for everyone from the earliest stages through to high performance or to long-term physical activity, being active for life. We believe that every Canadian, and again, probably everyone around the world, should be physically active for life through participation in sport, recreation, other kinds of physical activity. So the challenge is not just a sport challenge, it's very much a shared challenge with everyone in our societies who cares about our youth, their development, and there's, of course, lots and lots of good research, which I know you've been exposed to, that talks about the various benefits of participation, whether it's benefits in terms of school, learning, general health, resisting obesity, related diseases, and so on. So it's a shared project. It's not just sports' job to do. It's really everyone's job to do to make sure that we have a healthier society.
Well, I've got a question about implementation here for you from Rudy. What main implementation issues have you encountered, whether in terms of resources or otherwise?
Well, Rudy, I'm going to ask you to hang on to that question because that's really the part of the theme of the presentation. So I will be touching on that a little bit later on. And if you hang on, and if you don't feel I've answered your question about 20 minutes from now, ask it again, okay? So back to sport. If we break down sport alone and we think of it simply, we could say that in the early stages, learn to train, we want to focus mostly on technical skills, developing sport skills. After puberty, we want to work on developing the engine. That's the train-to-train stage. For more advanced athletes, as they progress towards becoming high-performance athletes, competition becomes more and more important. Learning the tactics, understanding how to prepare for competitions, understanding how to perform in competitions in various places and under different conditions. And then finally, we get to a state of perfecting in the train to compete and train to win stages, perfecting mental preparation, emotional preparation, being able to cope with different situations when traveling abroad to compete and so on. So, again, if we kind of take LTAD down to a simple level, we could say, let's focus on these main components as athletes progress. When we're dealing with children and youth, let's focus on giving them those fundamental movement skills and then the technical sport skills. And let's not worry too much about all those other aspects of sport that they can develop in good time as they progress. So again, this is a way of breaking down the project so that we can focus on what we need to do to help athletes at different points. But, it still means a lot of work for a national sport federation. Sometimes I'll use NSF, National Sport Federation. I may use also NSO, National Sport Organization. I mean the same thing. I mean a national organization for volleyball or wrestling or cycling or swimming. They have to consider how they can develop physical literacy for their athletes, but also how they can help their athletes catch up if they haven't developed all those foundational skills. They have to figure out how to help athletes who participate in multiple sports. They have to figure out how to prepare good training environments for athletes that are appropriate for each stage. An appropriate training environment for a 9-year-old is not the same as it is for a 19-year-old, of course. Have to think about how we make competition more meaningful. Do we modify our competitions to make them more developmentally appropriate? How do we educate our coaches and leaders? How do we make sport more accessible for everyone? So it is a long and daunting list, and we know from experience that every sport organization has looked at a list like this and said, wow, how do we get the resources to do that? How do we even begin to take the first bite out of this tremendous task? So I just want to suggest a basic process, a very simple basic process, 5 steps. First of all, building awareness. Secondly, exploration, including gap analysis, taking an inventory, and then identifying needs and opportunities. Making some decisions about what to do first, what can we accomplish in the next year. Moving into implementation, where are the quick wins? What are some things that we can do to establish success in the short term? And then, of course, assessment. What worked? What could be improved? What are our next steps? So a pretty simple process to take small steps to get towards a big goal. And I just want to touch on building awareness first. And here's a great opportunity for you to chime in. Think of 3 ways that you could build awareness about long-term athlete development and physical literacy among your sport organizations, coaches, leaders, and partners. And by partners, I'm including other groups like education, healthcare, government, and so on. So think of a couple, and you can type some in the chat box, or you can put your hand up and Tyler will recognize you and we can talk. But just brainstorm a couple of ways that you can build awareness. Take a few seconds and do that. And Tyler, if we don't see any exciting activity, we'll go out into the crowd and we'll start asking people questions.
No, we're getting some feedback here in the question pane. So Clarence suggests workshops and clinics. Anthony suggested having forums. Clarence also suggested coaching retreats. Kabir mentioned workshops as well. Anthony said advertising. Andy said bring structure into communities. Clarence mentioned discussions with parents.
Well, those are great. And if we don't get too many more, that was a really good list. So thank you for that. Exactly. The first stage is very much one about helping people understand what this is and why it could be beneficial to do. So we've heard a few. Let's look at my list. And you'll see that my list has most of the things that you've already identified. Doing presentations, distributing framework documents, like the long-term athlete development guides, providing brief summaries of those. Again, many Canadian sport organizations try to distill it down to, 1 page worth of key points that they could put on their websites or that they could share in a 1-page format. Sharing online resources, sharing links to online resources. As you know, everything on our Sport for Life website is a free download. And we're having resources in English and French, unfortunately not Spanish, but we do have a lot of resources that people can access for free. And, various electronic means, again, as some of you mentioned. So you can send out emails to your coaches, put it on websites, social media, tweet events out. Lots of different ways to build awareness about different aspects of long-term athlete development. And again, we've seen in Canada some organizations doing a really fantastic job of getting the word out, especially to their coaches and clubs on an ongoing basis about an event that they're hosting, a competition that just ran, a speaker who's coming to town, things of that nature. So that's a great place to start.
We've got just a couple more here that people have shared, Paul, that I'll just mention out. An interactive mobile app, workshops that can take place between sports organizations to help bring them together, potentially a pilot project with limited number of participants, which could then help define certain strengths and weaknesses. And the last suggestion here was share some examples to inspire coaches, but also teachers and parents. Look around and share some easy possibilities to construct and implement.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all great as well. And I want to particularly take note of the one about bringing together several sport organizations. One of the places that happens for us is our annual summit. Another place that happens is in the way that we offer and deliver coaching training in Canada, where often coaches from different sports get together. So there's some places that are already built in, and you may have places in your system also that are similar, where sport leaders naturally come together, and those are great opportunities to both build awareness and also to get dialogue going about how to do this across different sports. So thank you for that. I'm just going to turn to exploration now and ask this question, because once you've built awareness and there's an understanding that this is something to pursue, most organizations face the challenge of evidence gathering, data gathering, understanding exactly what their situation is and where there are gaps to address. So same question, how could you support some data collection and gap analysis to get a better handle on what needs to be done in sport organizations? So again, I'll give you a chance to type in the chat box or pop your hand up if you want to, and Tyler will do the work of sharing.
And Paul, just while people are thinking of some input for this, we had one more question for you from Anthony. Do all NSFs try to do this together, or does each NSF go about implementing in their own way and time frame?
That's a great question. The way that it was set up in Canada, Sport Canada helped to support the NSFs to develop their own LTAD frameworks. So what they did was they brought together their own leading coaches and sport leaders with Sport for Life experts to create sport-specific models. But in one sense, it was everyone doing it together because all the sports were working on that process at the same time. And so there was lots of opportunity as it went forward for sharing. One thing that we saw was that the very first sports who created their frameworks did a good job, but by 2 years later, sports were reading those frameworks and building off what the first sports had done, and the frameworks were becoming stronger and stronger as they went because of that kind of cross-pollination and sharing. So the answer really is kind of both in Canada, but the sharing has been really powerful. Have we got any responses on exploration, Tyler?
We do. Dorian suggested maybe a simple online survey such as SurveyMonkey. And Rudy said that, again, going back to the idea of a pilot project, could aid documentation across stakeholders and be a reference point moving forward.
Yeah, those are some good ones. And again, this has been a challenge for sport organizations in Canada and elsewhere. Not everyone has all the data that they would like to have about participation, the level of their athletes, hard data about athlete performances, times, and so on. Some have more than others, and it has been a bit of a challenge. So there are different ways to gather the information to understand what it is that would be helpful. Online surveys are great, free or cheap. There are other means to gather data that are relatively inexpensive. The first step, of course, is to decide what questions you need answered. And then from there to think about, okay, what are some means of doing it? But there are ways to gather the data that will be relatively inexpensive and fairly quick, and can support your planning and development process.
And then just a couple more here, Paul. Feedback forms was suggested, conducting interviews, sport camps, and then a suggestion from one of the participants in Suriname is that sport organizations should have more direct lines with the ministries, sport and education, and vice versa.
Yeah, well, I agree with the last point, but going back one point, when you said camps, clinics, there are, again, many places over the course of the year where groups of athletes do get together, national championships, other kinds of events, and those are ideal opportunities to gather data. Likewise, opportunities where coaches get together is another good place to gather data. So it doesn't always have to be very expensive, because you can take advantage of those times and places where people do come together to gather data more effectively. So that was a good comment, and I appreciate that one too.
There's another comment here from Priscilla. She says that in some countries, not all the sports are installed in the curriculum.
Well, yeah, I mean, in Canada, in some ways, the school curriculum is quite separate from sports, and there is no requirement to teach specific sports in most provincial school curricula at all. They are taught because the teachers are familiar with them, but sports, for example, that are not included have tried to become included and not had always great success. So schools are not a one-stop solution for all our challenges in sport. It can be challenging to get partnership with education, but that's again one reason why it's so important. So thanks for that comment, Priscilla. It's the same here in a lot of ways. I want to show you a little bit about how Speed Skating Canada, just a couple of quick slides about how Speed Skating Canada addressed this challenge of gathering information. So, you know, they said they wanted to be the world leading speed skating nation, short track and long track. Speed skating is probably a good sport to pick, because I'm not aware of really strong Caribbean nations in speed skating. So if there are, please correct me, but I probably won't be insulting anybody too much if I talk about speed skating. In Canada, obviously, it's a big deal. So this is how Speed Skating Canada went about it. Part of what they did with their analysis was to begin by saying, all right, how many high-performance athletes do we need at the top of the pyramid if we're going to be able to achieve our performance goals? So they did an analysis, and they came up with 20 male and 20 female long track, 10 and 10 for short track. And they did that analysis based on various factors, including dropout, injury, where the rest of the world was in terms of having numbers that were capable of podium performances, and other pieces to their analysis. But they said, okay, at the peak of the pyramid, we need this many athletes. Now, how are we going to get them? How are we going to get there? So they worked backwards, and they said, all right, based on our historical rates of dropout, transfer to other sports, and so on, we would need about 400 to 500 skaters in Learn to Compete, which is their what they called Train to Compete. Most stages call it Train to Compete, versus about 150 that they currently had. They also, going back a step in the long-term athlete development model, reckoned they needed 800 to 1,000 skaters in train-to-train that were in high-quality training environments, and they had about 350. So they were able to say, based on their analysis, where they needed more skaters and at what level they needed more skaters. So then from there, they continued to work it to figure out, all right, how many coaches do we need? How many high-quality training environments do we need to service that number of athletes that we identified? How long will it take them to work in that environment? And these are kind of lessons that we can take and apply in our own sports. So, what's our current baseline? How many athletes have we got? How many have we got at all levels? How many have we got capable of podium performance? How many have we got capable of national championship performance? How many have we got capable of regional championship? How many have we got just entering the sport and taking the first steps? And how many are we losing? How long are they staying involved? What's the quality of their training environment? Some of those things are some of the data that we can start collecting to figure out where we need to focus our efforts. What are your easy wins? So based on each sport's reality, where could we do something that would be effective in the immediate term or the short term, say 6 months, 12 months? How do priorities vary across the country? How do they vary between countries? But as I already mentioned, in Canada, the very small provinces like Prince Edward Island and Atlantic Canada are very, very different from Ontario. Quebec is very, very different from British Columbia. So all of these things can be part of that analytical process in the exploration phase that I was talking about. And that brings us to making a decision. So once we've got it figured out, once we've done some analysis, we've figured out where it is that we need to focus for the next year to take our first steps. How do we decide our priorities? What are our resources? Who are our champions? And then where are we going to put our eggs? So next opportunity for you to think a little bit, just think of one initiative in either your nation, your sport organization, depending on who you are representing, that you think could be successful right now. If you were going to launch an initiative to introduce long-term athlete development or put it to work in your organization or your nation, what would the one thing that you would put your chips on be? Where would you focus your resources to be successful in the short term? So once again, you can pop your hand up, you can type in the box. Tyler will read. Already had some great examples of how you would build awareness and some ways to gather information to do that data collection. But if you kind of had a single project that you wanted to put forward right now, what would it be?
Okay, we've got some suggestions coming through involving more female athletes. And another one is collaboration of various club, junior academies and their resources.
Yeah, I like both of those. Female athletes, generally we don't have as many in our systems as male athletes, and so it represents a place where if we could recruit a few more, we might have significantly more success. So that was a great one. And yeah, the collaboration one is also a great initiative.
Another one here, PE lessons in Suriname. After school activity involve parents because it starts at home. And another suggestion here, educate the coaches to be able to deliver better and more meaningful sessions.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I mean, they're all good, but coaching is something that I would say the majority of organizations in Canada have identified as probably the #1 way to integrate long-term athlete development and physical literacy into their programs. If you train each new coach or new generation of coaches and you include this information about how to do it, they are the ones who are working directly with the athletes. They are in the best position to actually implement a long-term athlete development-based program. So that's really important as well.
We've got a rugby example here. Since rugby is not played in schools, it is hard to recruit. The easiest way to go to a few select schools and do an after-school program. So that was one suggestion. We have community and youth club development as another suggestion. And another one yet is get more clubs involved in developing the sport and national competition. A judo example, making the judo sport more popular, which will lead to the need for more capable trainers and coaches. Another suggestion is to offer more incentives to coaches for podium success at varying levels. And then we had a comment also. Andy says, I want to start in the different communities, junior clubs, basketball, volleyball, soccer, etc.
Yeah, and again, those are all great, and so thank you for sharing those, because I can't remember them all, but I can remember the last one. So one thing again that in Canada, um, not in all sports, but in many sports, we found that having a more kind of regional hub basis for junior performance development has been effective. If every club put a heavy focus on junior development, we'd have, 2 juniors here, 3 juniors there. Again, we don't have a huge population, and it is spread out pretty widely in some provinces. So having a kind of a hub and saying, okay, this club is going to be the designated junior performance development club in this region or this country or this province has been a approach that's worked well here, and an interesting thing to think about as well in terms of focusing our resources. That way we can sort of focus coaching that is specialized in junior development, and we can do some other things as well around building that training environment. So that was a good one I wanted to comment on. So we've heard a few, and again, I really appreciate you sharing because you've got a ton of good ideas. So I think you're probably at the point of rolling up your sleeves. I just want to turn to strategies and actions that will help us get to where we need to go. And I want to share with you a woman named Mary-Pierre Charret did her PhD research on how our provincial sport organizations in Quebec, she was in the province of Quebec, went about implementing long-term athlete development. And so she looked at 24 provincial sport organizations, and she identified 5 main kinds of things that they did. 5 main kinds of things that they did, and here they are. Awareness, regulatory, meaning rules and regulations, education, administrative, and recruitment. So I'm just going to go through these and give you some examples of what some of these are. We've already talked about awareness, so you've seen this slide before, and we've already spoken to this one. But this is, one of the key ways that she found organizations went about trying to implement long-term athlete development. So we've already seen this one. Let's move on to regulations. Now, regulations, it's something that pops into most people's minds right away as well. If we could, as a National Olympic Committee or as a National Sport Federation, if we could make a rule that said you had to do something, that might be the quickest and easiest way to get there. And here's 5 bullet points that give some examples of ways that you could do that. If you have funding that's given out, you could link it to LTAD implementation. You could make changes to your competition calendar. You could change the kind of competition, the rules of the competition, to change the format, to make them more developmentally appropriate or helpful. You could change the recognition system. Somebody already mentioned that this evening in terms of how coaches, for example, get recognized, how athletes get rewarded, prizes, and so on. If you give prizes for the most skillful athlete instead of the fastest one, that's a way of emphasizing what it is you want to develop. You can create a common pathway for different disciplines within a sport. You could say, okay, if you're under the age of, say, 12, you have to do both sprint and middle distance events on track instead of specializing early. So there's a number of ways you can use rules. But as I'm going to comment at the end, there's also some downsides to just using regulation. So we will talk about that a bit more. Education. A little different from awareness. Awareness is showing people, telling people that something exists. Education is more the more intensive training camps, clinics, workshops for coaches, going to clubs and doing presentations about how to do something. They take longer to develop and build, but again, there are lots of good examples in Canada and other countries around the world that you're in a position to borrow, adapt, and use without necessarily having to build them all from scratch. Your coaching certification program that I spoke about earlier was a good case in point. The foundation is there. There's something there to build on. Administration, what do I mean by that? Well, this is how your organizations do their business, and they can integrate long-term athlete development in a number of different ways. You can build it into the hiring of coaches, for example, or the assessment of coaches, the recruitment of volunteers, the way that money is spent, or the way that the organizations are governed. You could put in place a committee, for example, to support long-term athlete development. So a number of ways to do it administratively. And then finally, recruitment. Again, how do you attract new people? How do you find athletes? Well, marketing campaigns, yes, that's been mentioned. Look at the talent identification and selection process. You're probably all doing this now in some way. Well, what if you did it differently? What, for example, if we looked for, again, skills instead of size or speed for young athletes? Australian cycling did an interesting thing. Cycling is my particular sport. Australian cycling launched a nationwide talent identification process that was completely self-reported. They said, okay, measure off 400 meters, ride it as fast as you can, and just send in your time. Now you might look at that and say, well, what if they lie? What if they say that they did it twice as fast as they do? Well, what Australian cycling did was when they got those times, they would contact the fastest athletes and go out, and then they would go out to them and say, okay, so, you said you could do this in 20 seconds or whatever. Let's see you do it. But it was tremendously powerful because people could simply just try it and send in their time, right? You didn't have to do all the organizing up front. You can create new activities. The example I gave here is an activity in volleyball called smash ball, which started in Holland and which some Canadian provinces are starting to deliver. Smash ball is kind of a modified form of volleyball that's meant to appeal to basically young boys because by lowering the net and giving them more opportunity to spike the ball, it's more fun and it requires less skill, so it gets them interested in volleyball when just playing the traditional game might not be as engaging. So there's some examples for recruitment. So I see here in the chat, Tyler has brought in a question from Tyrone. Let me just read that. Could we provide the study by Sheree and where it can be found? Yeah, I can do that. We can email that out after the call. I can't quickly put it in the chat box myself, but I can certainly point you at it, so I'm happy to do that. However, it might be in French. So there's the list. There's the 5. And again, I challenge you to think about where you see opportunities within those 5 areas. And I won't ask you for them now, but I will leave this with you. Think about how we can do more than one of these. Ideally, how we can do all of them. Think also about what you control and what you simply influence. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, in the smallest circle here, the green circle, that's a circle of control that, for example, if you were a national sport federation, you would control these things. You would control national team selection. You would control hosting of national championships, probably, maybe coach certification. The next ring out, which is red, you have direct influence, but you don't have the same level of control. So national, regional competitions, for example, or the way that local training centers or coaches do what they do in your country. You can influence them, but you can't be there all the time, so you're one step less in terms of your level of control. You have direct influence, but you don't have total control. And then out in the farthest circle, the blue circle, you have indirect influence. So when you're talking to parents, for example, or your local clubs, you do it through communication, you do it through education, but it's not so easy simply to say, you need to do this. So going back to the 5 that we were talking about just a second ago, if you take that and you kind of think about where do I have control? Well, where I have control, I can use rules. I can use administrative changes. Where I only have direct influence, I can use education. I might be able to use recruitment. And where I have indirect influence, maybe all I can use is awareness and educational means. So it's a way of thinking about which kinds of initiatives might work in different settings. And I want to bring a couple of points forward from both Mary Pierre's research and my own research. And here they are. I'm not going to tell you who's they're from, but it's kind of, I'm glommed them together here. Awareness. It's the easiest, it's the cheapest, it's the most popular, but by itself, it doesn't make the difference. You need to start by explaining what this new idea is, but by itself, that won't get people adopting it. Regulation, setting rules, on the other hand, it seems like the easy way to go, but naturally, as everyone knows, when you set a rule, you start to get people pushing back and saying, well, you know, I'm not going to do it, or other kinds of political challenges that you encounter when you change the rules. One thing that might happen with rule changes also is you might have some unintended consequences. So in some instances, we see in Canada that if you provide incentives, for example, to clubs, if you reach a certain level of delivery, for example, if you have a trained coach or if you have a certain kind of training environment that you provide, well, the biggest, richest clubs can do that, and we found that in some cases they would then use the power that they got to try to squeeze out the smaller clubs and put them out of business. It wasn't what anybody thought would happen, and nobody intended it, but it is important to think through what could happen when you do rule changes. Now, my third point there, parent and coach education, as I mentioned, this is one that just about everybody says is the essential thing to do, and which they also hold up as a roadblock if it isn't done well. Coach education, but also parent education. Important to think about how you do that. Again, we found in many cases in the early days in Canada, sport organizations said, okay, we're implementing LTAD, and because of that, we have to make a whole bunch of changes. Well, the result was parents and coaches and clubs pushing back saying, well, then just don't implement LTAD because we don't like those changes. It's better for the sport organizations, and the sport that did this had more success, to say, we're going to make a few changes to improve the development of our athletes, and then to focus on how the change improves the athlete development process or their success, instead of giving it a label. When you label it LTAD, it made it easier for people to kind of push back against it. And finally, we recommend that, again, as I said, you try to come up with a strategy that uses all 5 kinds of action, not just one of these, because by themselves they're not as effective as all of them done together. So again, I'll leave this with you. You know, what are your opportunities to use each of these? Not just one, not just two, but how could you use each of these as you look to introduce and implement long-term athlete development? And that brings us to, you know, how we're going to set our objectives. So again, I'm sure that everybody's seen this in many times, many different ways, in many different settings. Just some ways to set effective objectives, clearly describing success, identifying some timelines, clear expectations, and having evaluation built right in so that you know how you're going to assess if it worked right from the very beginning. So as you think through using those 5 types of implementation strategy, also think about how are we going to set our goals in a way that we can measure them so that we'll know a year from now whether it's actually working. And maybe as a parting comment, almost my final comment, it's better to do a little a lot than it is to do a lot a little. Organizations that tried to change 10 things at once found it a lot harder than organizations that picked one key thing at a time. Just as we come to the end, I'm throwing in an advertisement here. We offer a program called S4L Leaders School. It's going into its 5th year in 2017. It's a 1-year-long program. It starts at our summit in January, and then we have webinars like this one, but a little bit longer. We have a number of key leaders in Canadian sport and physical activity who present our webinars. We have 10 of them over the course of the year. So it's a really good opportunity to explore all this more intensively. It is done by distance education, so it might be useful for our friends in the Caribbean as well as Canadians. And what we do is, in addition to the webinars, we encourage each of our leaders in Leaders School to take on a year-long project, which is something like the projects that have been taken on as part of this CANOC program, and advance them. So the leaders in Leaders School support each other, and we support the leaders to implement their project over the course of the year. And we also have this series of webinars. So registration is still open, and I wanted to bring it to anyone's attention who's on the call this evening, because it might be a way to continue learning and to get support in implementing long-term athlete development and physical literacy as you go forward in the coming year. So if you are interested in Leaders School, by all means, please contact Tyler or myself directly, and we can give you information about registration. So that brings me to the end. I've got a couple of minutes to spare. We wanted to keep it to an hour, and I think I'm at about 55 minutes. So if there's any questions or comments, this would be a great time. We've got a couple minutes left. And again, you can type in the chat box or put your hand up and speak. If you want to contact me, there's my email address. I'm happy to help and answer questions for anyone or share resources if you have a request for resources. I already have that request for Mary Pierce Charet's research, and I can provide that. So if you drop me a line, I can send that as well. So any questions, happy to take them, and otherwise, thanks very much for being a part of our webinar.
Yeah, and just while we wait to see if some questions pop up, wanted to give a quick shout out to Suriname. They give a special award for the judo athlete who displays the best style of fighting, and this they do to try and move the athletes to focus on their skills.
Nice, like that.
So a question here from Darren. You may have missed it, but what did you say was the estimated time frame for the implementation of LTAD?
I think what I tried to answer at the time was that most of the sports in different nations started working on this somewhere between 2003 to 2005 or 6. Canada started providing funding to support sports in 2005. One way to answer the question is to say that within about 2 or 3 years, sports had built their sport-specific LTAD framework, and they had started integrating it in coach education, adapting some of their programs. So in terms of getting implementation underway, 2 to 3 years. In terms of getting it all the way through the system so it became the standard everywhere, some sports of course are still not there, others are getting well along, but probably 10 years is more normal. It's been a 10-year project for us, at least so far.
And just a reminder to everybody, within the next day or two, I will be sending out to you a copy of Paul's presentation, so all of the slides that you saw here, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. So if there was something that you missed that you wanted to hear again, you'll be able to go through and listen to that. And also I will get the information on the Charet research, and I will include that in the email as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Tyler.
Great, yeah, and thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this and to share all this information with everybody. It's great. And once more, you've got Paul's email address there on the screen. If you have any questions for me about this webinar or about past webinars or about any other Sport for Life content or material, feel free to contact me. It's the same email address except Tyler, Tyler, @sportforlife.ca. And Paul, we've got a couple of questions coming in here. Was the Sport for Life program implemented for athletes with disabilities in Canada, or was that separate?
That's an excellent question. It was implemented for both able and disability athletes. As you know, there are some sports where athletes with a disability are integrated into the sport, and other sports where they compete separately or even have their own sport associations. We've worked with all of them together all the way through. It has taken a little bit longer for the integrated sports to work through the integration of LTAD into their disabled athletes. But I would say that we've tried to do it all at the same time and have had quite good success.
Great, and a couple of questions from Kabir here, asking about implementation and how smoothly it goes. Kabir assumes that there were hiccups and is curious what those hiccups might be during the implementation process.
Yeah, I could probably do another hour-long webinar just on hiccups. Certainly there's been lots of challenges along the way, and more in some sports than others. There are many factors that contribute to either success or less success. I touched on a couple in the webinar earlier. A lot has to do with the way the changes are presented and implemented. If again you take the position that, look, there's a new thing, it's called LTAD, and we have to change everything now, you're bound to get both more resistance and you've given people an easier target to shoot at. If, as you implement step by step, you say, oh, we're changing this aspect of youth competition because we want to improve the development of our athletes, it's been successful in other countries around the world and we're implementing it, then sports that did it that way, I think, found more success and smoother sailing. So that's just one example. There's probably lots, but yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try to fool anybody by saying that there haven't been challenges or that it went easily in every sport.
Okay, great. And then maybe just one more question here. And again, if any questions come up after this, please feel free to email Paul or myself. And the final question is this: since it is a shared challenge, do you have any recommendations or indications what could be some of the responsibilities from key leaders or organizations?
Well, yeah, we have worked hard to bring the other sectors in and show them that it isn't just about sport. So, for example, when you're dealing with education, educators, their job is not necessarily to put elite athletes on the podium, and so you have to talk to them in their language about child development and why physical literacy is important in meeting learning objectives as well as health, to get their attention. Likewise, when you're dealing with, for example, public health agencies, their interest is in health, not so much in getting athletes on podiums. So we have tried to speak the language of the people that we're talking to bring them on board. We have organized lots of events, including our summit, that bring people from different sectors together, and then they get it because they're able to share with each other. Some other things like that can be helpful as well. It's not so much whose responsibility it is for anything, so much as how will we get people together to have the conversation about how this can be helpful for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you again very much, Paul, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to attend this webinar. We hope that you found it informative, and there will be more in the future, so stay tuned. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.